We have been conceptualizing national health systems as if they were autonomous units, not affected by anything happening outside the borders of a country, but of course we all know that's not the world that we live in today. So now we're going to shift gears and begin talking about the concept of a global health system. And this is a concept that is relatively new, so it's something that you may not have heard too much about in your previous studies or in your work. It's a concept that has emerged analogous to national health system, but really only in the last 5 to 7 years, I would say, has this notion of a global health system really been sort of put on the table. But in the same way that concepts and conceptual frameworks are only useful if they're useful for something, we hope, as you think through why might it be useful or not to, in fact, begin to conceive of what's happening at the transnational level as, in fact, a system. You can think of it as one system, you can think of it as multiple systems, but that's the main topic of the second half of the class today. Okay, so let's dive right in. So first, in the same way that we went through national health systems by looking at different key concepts that relate and that might help you think in a more structured or systematic way about national health systems, we're going to do the same thing at the global level. So we'll start by looking at actors and boundaries. So who are the main actors in the global health system, and how might we actually set boundaries around it? Just to refresh your memory a little bit, if you'll remember, I think a mere 2.5 weeks ago, the very first day of class, we went through the notion of the concept of what is global health, and we talked about, of course, the global transfer of health risks as being analogous to the national epidemiological profile at national level, and we talked about what is the organized social response, and the global health system as being the equivalent or the analogous concept at the international level. We went through transfers of health risks, again, just to refresh your memory. And now we're talking about what is the social response, the global social response to these types of health risks. Okay, so first let me begin with the question, who might the main actors be? When you think of the global health system, what types of actors, organizations do you think of?
Foundations.
Foundations, any one in particular?
Gates.
Okay. Yes, Mary.
World Health Organization.
The World Health Organization? Yes, no.
United Nations.
United Nations system as a whole.
System as a
Right,
whole.
so WHO and other
UNICEF.
agencies. Right, what are some other agencies that might be relevant?
UNICEF is one.
UNICEF, great. UNHCR for refugees, for example. Zina and then Kristen.
Civil societies, NGOs.
Civil society, can you give me some specific examples?
Like MSF or IRC.
Big international NGOs, also smaller nonprofit organizations maybe that might be in networks, for example. Kristen?
NIH? The
NIH? Yes. Why might NIH, which is the U.S. National Institutes of Health, a major research funder, why might you think of that as a global actor?
Because a lot of the research they do, both in the U.S. and helping fund globally, loopholes, has a huge impact on the outcome of global health, where funding goes and where attention is put.
Yeah, so they have they fund certainly activities outside the United States, but also the impact is can be very external. Yes, Gabe, and then we'll move to the
private
next person.
companies like multinational.
Yes, absolutely, great.
I was thinking of sort of the unique and recent phenomenon of like an alliance or a partnership like PMNCH or the Global Fund, which are, I think,
PMNCH.
the Partnership for Maternal Newborn Child Health.
Okay.
Yeah.
Or what was the
Global
other?
Fund
Global
or
Fund.
Rollback Malaria.
Gavi.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so you can think of these as aggregations of actors. Sometimes you can think of networks that tie different actors together and maybe help to coordinate them. I think, Daniel, you had a...
Should we consider countries actors?
Governments, certainly.
Government.
Yes, governments of countries, absolutely. So let's see if we covered all the categories. Pretty good. You left out Harvard. That's okay. Professional associations, somebody mentioned in their thought paper a professional association, I believe. Can anyone give me an example of a professional association that might be considered a global actor?
Doctors Without Borders.
Doctors Without Borders, yes. Sometimes considered a professional organization, sometimes considered a civil society organization.
For example, the American Psychiatric Association is a global player in mental health.
Yes, yes. So oftentimes networks of, let's say, psychiatrists or cancer specialists, or I mean, we see these organizations oftentimes as important players in one form or another. Yes.
I have a question about the religious organizations.
Religious
Where
organizations.
do
Yes,
they
and
fall?
we'll
Is
have
it
them
the
here, actually.
philanthropic or civil society? So how can we classify them? And between those, like, are they a separate entity or they go with one another?
That's a great question. I think one could categorize them under civil society, and it depends on how narrow or broad a conceptualization of civil society you might want to adopt, and it depends on
Which religion?
which theorist, political organization. Or you could certainly add another bullet point here and help our textbook become a more thorough and accurate textbook. Yeah, okay. So these are the types of actors operating, any actor really that's operating across borders, transnationally, would be useful to consider within the scope of the system. How might we define the boundaries? If you remember when we talked about national health systems, we also talked about where do you actually draw the line, because there's so many determinants of health, about the health performance of a society. Yeah, Keith.
Can you use the same criteria of primary intent?
Primary intent to improve health.
Yeah.
That's in fact what we did. So you can easily apply, again, national concepts in some cases to the global level. So you see all of the actors here that you mentioned, and the little C's are intended to represent countries. Countries should probably be bigger in this circle, but it's hard to fit 200 countries into the circle, so please don't take that as a normative statement regarding the importance of governments. Governments are probably the most influential, if not among the most, if not the most influential and powerful actors still today, operating at the transnational level. The boundaries that we put around the system here are exactly as Guy was saying, actors with the intent to improve health, and yet we have also these other sectors. Which we are not, the equivalent looking at the national level would be, of course, looking at all of the other sectors that shape the social determinants of health. Similarly, at the transnational level, you have different sectors operating. So, for example, you have the World Trade Organization, which may pass a number of rules that can have an effect on health. You may have, similarly, the Food and Agricultural Organization. Okay. So these blue bridges here are intended to signal the function of cross-sectoral advocacy, which again we were talking about at the national level just a few minutes ago. Similarly, you can think that at the international, the transnational, international level, there is a need for global health actors to be able to engage in cross-sectoral advocacy. And this is just a selection of the other issue areas that may have a pretty direct effect on health, and where that type of building of bridges, if you will, may be an important function for the system as a whole to carry out. Okay, so moving beyond actors and boundaries, now we've defined the thing that we're talking about. Let's move on to functions, governance, and challenges. And by the way, as with many other topics in this course, what we're going through today is in fact the subject of an entire course in and of itself, offered in the spring. So we're just giving you exposure to the main concepts. So as you saw in your readings, we posit that there are, in fact, four main types of functions of the global health system, and these are the four. We'll go through these one by one. The first is the production of global public goods. This is a broad category. And can anybody give me a definition of what is a public good? Let's start just with the concept of a public good.
Talked about intellectual property, is that one?
Intellectual property, so knowledge, information is a good example of a public good, and intellectual property systems are often set up in order to try to generate knowledge. And again, I'm trying to make a distinction here between the concept of a public good and something that's good for the public, the public good. That's a different concept. What is a public good? It's an economic concept. It's generally where you're exposed to this idea. What is it about knowledge that makes it a public good? That's a quintessential classic public good. What is it about that?
Everybody can use it and translate it for what they need.
Everyone can use it. So great. So that it's non-excludable. That's the technical term behind it. That everyone can use that good. Now, if I use a bit of this knowledge, maybe you could say this is some kind of knowledge. I use it. I apply it to some paper I write, and it's useful for me. Does that mean that I've depleted this? There's less left for other people? Alright, so non-rivalrous, that's the other, again, the technical concept, that a pure public good is non-excludable. Every member of the public can in fact consume that good or access or make use of that good. And at the same time, you don't deplete the good. It's non-rivalrous, so as many people who want to make use of that good as possible are able to do that. This is a classic definition of a public good. What might be the notion of a global public good versus a national public good? What might be the distinction between those two concepts? Yes, Jessica.
Let me take a stab at this. So a national public good would be available only within that country, and a global public good be available to everyone.
Yeah.
National public goods, I was sort of thinking like roads.
Roads are one example.
I wasn't getting far with global public goods.
No, roads are often given as an example of a sometimes kind of an impure class public good. So they tend to be non-excludable. Everyone can use them, but of course, once you have too many cars on the road, they become a bit rivalrous. But roads are often given as an example. National defense. So that would protect people within a particular country, but it's not the same thing as, let's say, global defense against an asteroid or something. Okay, so this is the concept of global public goods, that the benefits are non-excludable to a global population. And again, knowledge, I would argue, can be thought of as a global public good. And not only in today's era of information technology, it's no longer really a national public good. Knowledge and information is a global public good, as long as it's accessible. Okay, so production of global public goods, typically at national level, usually it's the government, has some responsibility for providing public goods because markets are not expected to produce them in an adequate quantity to meet needs. And similarly, at the global level, we have questions regarding how do we ensure that we have enough global public goods created when there is no global government? We don't have an equivalent to a national government at the global level to ensure that public goods are in fact supplied. So this is both a function, but I would argue a challenge that we face. So what are some examples of global public goods? Research, you can cut off the second half and just think about research purely, or research and development, let's say of new health technologies. Standards and guidelines, either for national use, so WHO, for example, may issue a set of guidelines that are useful for a number of member states to guide national policy, or they can be guidelines that help to regulate international transactions. What might be an example of a standard or a guideline that would regulate an international transaction? You can think in the health context or beyond the health context.
Tariffs?
Usman.
In the international accounting standards?
Yes, perfect. Exactly. So that's a standard that helps coordinate, in fact, practices perhaps within a firm or multiple firms across different countries. Okay, comparative evidence and analysis, you can consider a type of research, but similarly a type of global public good. Okay, the second category would be management of externalities across countries. What's an example of an externality? What is an externality?
Well, I guess it would be like there's a lot of environmental or a lot of trade externalities. For example, we have a lot of cheap clothes because people in Bangladesh are living in or working in working conditions that wouldn't be allowable here, getting paid wages that wouldn't be allowable here.
Okay, so environmental externalities, ones that cross border?
I conflate those, so I
Yeah, I think the issue of different standards is certainly, I think, a great example of transnational health risk. But in externality, you were talking about the environment.
So where I was originally going was that, we, like carbon emissions in developed nations are really, really
Yes.
high, which affects everyone, actually,
Right.
more countries.
Right. So the one country may generate a whole lot of carbon, but the effects do not stay within the borders of that one country. They have external effects, so we call them externalities. And there has to be some way of managing the externalities that cross borders. So an example of management of externalities in the health sector are certainly information surveillance and information sharing regarding the spread of infectious disease, for example, or the fact that a tsunami is traveling across the ocean, and coordination for preparedness and response. Okay. The third, mobilization of global solidarity. What do we mean by this? Yes, here.
In crisis situation, like when there is a war and there are refugees that are and people that are displaced, so
Right.
the community, the global community needs to provide a response for those populations that are not taken care of by the government that is undergoing
Exactly.
instability.
So the basic concept behind mobilization of global solidarity is that there are times when a nation state, a national government, which is generally accepted to be primarily responsible for the health of its people, that a national health system and a state is responsible for the well-being of its own population. There are times when it cannot do so. And that can be acute, it can be armed conflict, wars, it can be natural disasters. It can also be, of course, chronic, that you have countries, for example, that may lack the resources, the necessary resources, to provide even the most basic level of health protection to its own population. And in that sense, in that case, there would be a case for mobilizing global solidarity for the international community to step in and provide some kind of support. And so you have development finance, of course, you have technical cooperation, so it's not just the flows of money that we're talking about, but flows of expertise and know-how. Humanitarian assistance, very much in the case of acute emergencies, and agency for the dispossessed. What might we mean by agency for the dispossessed? It's a very poetic, it's a very good phrase. Yeah, Zina.
Well, taking the example of refugees, if their home government is not providing, if the health system is not responding to their needs, and so therefore they're dispossessed in the sense that their host government is.
Yes. So I think that's a great example of the types of groups that we might consider to be dispossessed in a particular situation. What might we mean by this function of agency? So let's say you have a group of refugees who's crossed the border from Syria into Lebanon, as you wrote about in your thought paper. What might the function of agency look like? Yeah, Jen.
Well, if normally it's their national health system that's responsible, bears the responsibility for meeting their health needs, but they've left that context because their government can't or won't meet those needs, then who is then accountable for it? So it's I guess stepping in to take the responsibility for recognizing and coming up with a means of addressing those needs.
Yeah, so part of what you were just talking about, I think, might fall under humanitarian assistance. But the notion of agency here, what we're getting at is the notion of advocacy, that somebody needs to be, as you were saying, taking responsibility or advocating for the needs of certain people whose government may no longer or may never have, in fact, done that. So minority groups are also sometimes considered to be dispossessed in a particular group, groups marginalized for one reason or another. And then the fourth category of stewardship, which should not be relatively familiar to all of you. So under stewardship, we've listed a set of different functions that are specifically important at the transnational level. So convening for negotiation and consensus building, setting priorities. And another angle of the example that you were just raising, Michael, might be considered this is a case where stewardship has not been properly performed. The making or setting of rules, evaluation for mutual accountability, as well as cross-sectoral advocacy, which we illustrated earlier with the bridges coming outside of the blue circle. We'll spend a bit more time on functions during the exercise, so I don't want to go through them let's not spend too much more time on them now, except to consider for a minute how these may differ from the functions that we were just looking at last class of national health systems. What might be different about what you would want a national health system to do versus what is required at the transnational level?
I was thinking before you brought up that question that there's there's a difficulty in applying the same framework to the global health system. Even the name global health system seems to imply a level of organization and of hierarchical, responsibilities and things that are absent at the global level. And I guess it will be very difficult to, how do you account for that fundamental difference, right?
Yes.
There's actually no global health system per se. It's just it's an analytical, ex post reading of a whole mess.
No, that's excellent, and it's a perfect segue to, in fact, the next section of the lecture, because there is no hierarchy at the global, there is no hierarchical government or structure. There are structures, I would argue, and we'll go through those in just a minute. There are modes of organization beyond the level of the nation state, but there's nothing that you could really say is analogous, in fact, to the national level. We need to think differently about functions, but it also raises lots and lots of questions regarding governance, right? How do you actually get a system to work when you don't have the standard tools of governance that you have at national level? You don't have hierarchical authority, you don't have a president, you don't have a rule-making body, for example, and that's why some of the functions might be different. Can anyone give me an example of a function at the national level that we examined, I think just 3 or 4 days ago, that would not apply, that you did not see in this list? What's one of the main functions? Yeah.
Well, we talked about financial fairness, and this isn't really looking at what individuals are paying for healthcare. This is looking at cooperation between systems and aid, and it's a much different level.
So financing is a huge category within national health systems as a function, and fairness in financing as a criteria for the performance of national health systems. And you just see that's pretty much absent from this conceptualization in a case of global health system. Jen, did you want to? Okay. Nora, yeah.
The provision function of national, it's partly maybe in the mobilization for global solidarity, but it's not in a
Not the core, yeah.
similar to the national
Exactly.
function.
Exactly. So inherent in the concept of mobilization of global solidarity is this notion of sort of a limited function. When the nation state cannot perform its own duties, then you have a sort of global responsibility. Whereas at the national level, we're not saying that that the national health system has no business in service provision. We're saying it does. I mean, that's one of its core functions, right? Is service provision, but that is not a core function because there is no global service provider. So that's exactly right. So let's switch gears a little bit. I think we're starting to delve into the material in the second half here and talk about some of the challenges of global governance that Daniel was just mentioning and how these may relate to health in particular. Okay. So if you remember, we went through this already in the last session. Just again to refresh your memory quickly, we have major trends in globalization across a whole set of sectors. You don't need to read all this now, it's just to refresh your memory quickly. We have results and responses to globalization in terms of the context and the threats, opportunities and responses. And then I would argue there has been the beginnings of a globalization of governance, and the beginnings of the establishment of institutions to try to better manage human affairs beyond the level of the nation state. Compared to what we have at national level, these are really nascent. There's nothing that's equivalent to a strong national health system. If you think about all of the institutions that operate a strong national health system, we have nothing like that at the international or global level. But we do have the beginnings of a globalization of governance. So certainly we have an expansion of the numbers and types of actors. We were already talking about this sort of explosion in the types of actors that are active, that have influence at the transnational level. We have trends in terms of we used to have, let me say in terms of structure, we used to have, after the end of World War II, structures intended to govern global affairs that were primarily based on the nation state as the primary source of authority. The UN system is of course, the classic example of that, very much based on governments as being the main and only actors operating at the international level, and a shift to new types of institutions to manage problems. So we have sort of a proliferation of different types of ways of managing problems at the transnational level. And we have also a flowering of different types of processes. And these processes can be formal, such as deliberations at the World Health Assembly, for example, or they can be very informal, such as meetings that are convened in places like Harvard University to try to grapple with intractable and difficult problems. And these processes tend to be complex and multi-layered in this world that we're living in. So this is just, again, a rapid reminder of what shifts we've seen over the last 50 or to 70 years, I should say, more 70 years, in responses to globalization. So let's go back and think a little bit more precisely about what is the difference between global governance versus national governance, and we'll pause in the middle briefly for international governance. So the notion of national governance, of course, that you have governance within a nation state, and there's a clear hierarchy, as Daniel was pointing out, and there's a clear source of power and authority in a functioning nation state. Of course, when states break down, this is no longer the case. Then you have this notion of international relations, as it's been called. Can I see a quick show of hands as to who has taken an international relations course, either as an undergrad? Okay. Or elsewhere. So this is the way, in fact, we used to think, and in some cases, still think about governance beyond the transnational level. As I was mentioning just a minute before, states relating to each other. And the way that that concept is reflected is in the phrase international relations. So governance among states, there's still no hierarchy, there's still no global government, and the main questions that international relations scholars are concerned about are whether, when there's no hierarchy, do we live in a state of anarchy? Is there any alternative to domination, or is it possible to cooperate? And this is because we think about autonomous units of states sort of bumping up against each other in a transnational arena. This is sort of the classic way of thinking about international relations. As I was mentioning, we have begun to think more and more about this notion of global governance. So not just a bunch of autonomous units that bump up against each other defending their own interests, but rather a much more interconnected and complex system with many, many more actors besides states, often trying to, in fact, manage and respond to problems. So we have multiple actors, still no hierarchy, we still have no government, but if we have governance, then the types of questions that we might be concerned about may differ. We may be concerned more about who has authority to govern and make decisions, who has legitimacy, and how do we deal with the vast increase in complexity between this type of system and this type of system. Okay. So a nice definition of global governance might be one, this is a more academic definition, which includes a complex of formal and informal institutions, mechanisms, relationships, and processes. So this whole set of governance processes between and among, as I said, states, markets, citizens, and organizations, this whole range of actors, both inter and non-governmental, through which collective interests are articulated, rights and obligations are established, and differences are mediated. These would be the governance processes. Nice definition, super clear, right? Okay, maybe not. So a really simple way of thinking about what do we mean when we use this phrase global governance is really just a way in which the world organizes and collectively manages issues with global significance. And issues of global significance can be defined and are defined and redefined, of course, through social and political processes every day. So financial stability is just one example. But this is really just a everyday language paraphrasing of what is a very sort of much more precise academic definition. Okay, so how might global governance differ from national governance? Think about institutions. We already talked about the absence of hierarchy. This is the key feature that you learn on the first day of any international relations class. There is no global government, there is no hierarchy, and from that flows a whole host of problems or challenges. How else might national governance differ from global governance?
Can you use other hand?
Yeah.
Or flexing?
Like maybe as a consequence of not having hierarchy, the accountability issue
Accountability becomes challenging?
challenging.
Yeah.
absolutely. Jeremy, no?
Financing, there's no necessarily tax base to get financing for, and so it has to be maybe more voluntary.
Right, so the difficulty in generating financial resources to do anything collectively, right, because you don't have the authority to tax, right? Any other, think about institutions we have at the national level.
Well, you,
I was gonna say, in enforcing, standards or anything, at the national level, there's a system in place and, right, the state has a right, does certain things that the global
Enforcing rules, norms, and who does that at national level?
I mean, so it could be a Ministry of Health, for example, saying these are the standards of care for certain treatments. Whereas you can have those as suggestions from WHO, but enforcing them, right, it's a different story.
Zero, almost zero, I should say, capacity to enforce. Mary, is that a hand?
Oh, I scratched my face, but I was thinking
Not
about
scratch your face, but not your paw.
just the competing self-interest of the individual parts.
They're competing self-interests, sure, but that happens at national level,
Right.
right? How does that get resolved at national level when there's conflict between two parties?
Person in charge makes a decision. I mean, you do have a head of state, so.
Right, ultimately, there's a system of laws and adjudication, right? There's a judicial system, courts, that will ultimately resolve many, not all conflicts, of course, but many conflicts between people. So you came up with a number of examples, and again, in the interest of time, we won't go through all of them, but there are a number of institutions that we have at national level: legislatures, constitutions, law enforcement, judicial systems, hierarchical authority, coordinating bodies, taxation, shared cultures, histories, identities, and norms that we have at national level that we either have only in nascent form or pretty much not at all at the international level. So many of the institutions of governance we simply don't have. And so therefore many of these sort of governance functions are difficult to carry out or are not carried out at all at the international level. So these are key distinctions. And again, you can go through these in more detail. Right, so certainly you don't have sort of a uniform or rational way of setting priorities, because one country may say, we think HIV is your priority, and the other country may say, we don't really think so, but we'll take the money and there's not much we feel we can do about it. And certainly that is one example, I would argue, of a sovereignty challenge. So we put into three broad categories these three types of challenges that primarily relate to the structure of the global system. But before getting to that, let me just remind you again of the global context. And we went through this at the beginning of the class, so I'm not going to, again, spend a lot of time. But of course, we have a very complicated and diverse global context characterized by diversity, inequality, and complexity. Of course, it's important not to forget the global context, which is not only incredibly complex, but also in a time of transition. And again, we went through this. Let me go back to the next slide. We went through this during the first class. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. It's reasonable to think that governing a global society is just going to be more difficult for many different reasons from governing a national society. However, there are also more sort of structural types of challenges that come up that go beyond just the fact that we're talking about 7 billion people instead of, let's say, 10, 50, or 100 million. And so there's three main types of challenges that we put forth into a conceptual framework. And again, this is to help organize thinking around all the many, many different types of challenges. Concrete examples of challenges, such as the ones that both Kristen and Michael-Ann were raising, that you see come up all the time in health or elsewhere. And the first is the notion of a sovereignty challenge. Because you have the absence of a hierarchical political authority at the global level, this leads to all sorts of difficulties in mobilizing collective action among nation states. It leads to difficulties in enforcing compliance with so countries may come together and agree to do something, but you can't enforce compliance with those rules. It becomes very, very difficult to do that. So a number of challenges that come from the fact that we live in a world of sovereign nation states, and this is probably not likely to change anytime soon, with the important exception of the European Union. Second is the sectoral challenge. So there's a whole host of other challenges that come from the fact that you have a health sector that is primarily responsible for health, both at the national level, and one would argue that the concept of a global health system at the transnational level. But health is in fact increasingly affected by decision making that's happening outside the health sector. And this is very much a trend that we have seen at the transnational level over the last 30 years, I would argue. And then the third is an accountability challenge, which I think Jen was mentioning earlier. And you can think of this as at least two different ways. First, if we think about the institutions that we have created to better govern this global system that we have, those institutions tend to be state-based. So they're largely built on the principle of states as the sole legitimate representative of their population's interests. But in fact, you have a democratic deficit in international institutions. That kind of state-based governance is no longer adequate for ensuring that the needs of all people are met through these state-based institutions that we have. So there's one type of accountability challenge here. And a second type of accountability challenge that, in fact, the institutions that we have to govern non-state actors, this was the example I think that Usman was raising, are nascent or extremely weak or non-existent. And that you have some institutions to try to govern governments, but even less attention has been paid because the participation of non-state actors is a more recent phenomenon or the intensity of that participation, I would argue, has really increased with globalization, but the rules have not yet been developed to try to govern those interactions in the same way that they've been at the national level or with respect to states. And this leads to accountability challenges of a different sort. So I think one of the examples, for example, that Kristen was giving regarding HIV/AIDS, let's say you have a major foundation who believes that a country should prioritize HIV/AIDS, and that country's health minister or national health system does not happen to agree with that. And let's say the very well-resourced non-state actor comes in, offers a lot of money, distorts national health priorities, et cetera. What can be done to hold this foundation, let's say it's a foundation, accountable in that case? There's not a whole lot. There are some institutions, national institutions, of course, but there's not necessarily a robust international system. This is the type of, I don't know if that's the best, the clearest example, but this is really the
example of the first type is the exercise we just went through. You know, when WHO said, I'm going to rank and compare, the political discussion was, the countries that opposed it said WHO has no right to do that because WHO is accountable to us as governments. And WHO, in the voice of the Director General, Gro Brundtland, said, no, we're accountable to people, and comparing how governments perform is part of our accountability to people. And that was the underlying debate.
Yeah. And we see many times, for example, that state-based UN bodies, for example, are unable to act in certain circumstances because governments restrict the UN body from acting. So I think one of the classic examples is in a situation of war. When UN aid agencies, for example, we're seeing this today in Syria, in fact, until very recent, I think this is currently on the table at the Security Council, have UN agencies such as the UN Agency for Refugees, have not been able to offer aid in rebel-held areas because the government of Syria has not approved that, has been against that. And it's governments that call the shots at the UN because this is the type of structure that we have. Okay, there's a few additional slides that are just available on the website going a little bit further into the concept of international institutions. But I think what we want to do is, again, the notion here was to use this very brief chunk of time to introduce to you the concept of what is a global health system. And it's very much, as Daniel said, it's a concept and a set of concepts and a conceptual framework that is intended to help you think through the complexity of what you see happening around the globe today in the health sector. And to the extent that it's useful, that's great. If it's not, that's also okay. And to think about...
I would just add to Daniel's comment and to this point, saying that there is a system does not imply that it's a coherent and well-structured. It can be an incoherent system, which is what you see with the global health system, but you also have national health systems that are completely unstructured and chaotic. And it's not uncommon to hear, for example, here in the United States, very often people say, well, there's no health system here, right? It's totally chaotic. You have this and you have that and you have the other. There's no system. Now, that's an informal way of thinking of systems and not rigorous, because a system does not necessarily imply that all the pieces work together. There's a current of thinking in sociology called functionalism that presumes that systems are self-adjusting and borrows metaphors from biological and ecological systems, but even those systems do break down very often. So there's no presumption in a system or requirement that it be well coordinated and functioning. Just to clarify that applies also to the national level.
Absolutely. No, that's an excellent point. But the notion of a system as a set of actors and the relationships and the norms that govern their interaction, is that a useful way of beginning to make sense of what's happening at the international level? And this is where I think the concept of a global health system is something that we'd like to put on the table for your consideration. And therefore, if you can think of what's happening, I mean, this incredibly complex set of activities happening at the transnational level as a system, what should that system do? What do we want collectively as a global community to do, to perform? What are the functions we want to perform?